how to make a practice out of reflecting correctly, it does a lot of it come down to repetition and drilling. So going through the not necessarily just through the motions. You might have to start with going through the motions, but really, which can also be done even for reflection. That's what happens to people sometimes. Initially, you establish your mind upon certain reflexive attitude, upon certain context or a topic, but then afterwards you just want to almost like have a shortcut to it, and then just go through the mental motions and expect the same establishment. But needless to say, it doesn't work, or it stops working. That's when you know that your practice became mechanical, and that's when you either have to shift up the approach or again re-include your attempts at the shortcut into the present situation. So in other words, if, say for example, the context of your establishment of the mind is mind above sensuality, and you want to be always starting any reflection for that matter, doesn't matter the context, doesn't matter the topic you're trying to contemplate, you want to be doing it on the basis of the presently enduring situation. So right here, right now. But you don't just say, oh, I'm right here, right now, as a matter of fact. You have to, that kind of recognition needs to be rooted in how you feel right here, right now. Because as the Buddha said, things converge on the level of feeling. So, and that's exactly when your practice or meditation becomes mechanical. It's when it's not rooted in how you're feeling presently. When it's not rooted in the presently enduring feeling. That's the accurate way of putting it. So how you're feeling right now, and if the context, as I said, if the context is the practice of establishing the mind above the domain of sensuality, based on the currently enduring feeling, so let's say it's a neutral feeling, or say it's a pleasant feeling, as in pleasant as a good mood. So you want to, again, as the Buddha often encourages, you want to review your mind, not necessarily psychologically analyze it. Just stay on the level of the presently enduring feeling that's enduring there on its own for this whole time now. And then you want to review your mind in a sense of foresee, and reconsider whether whether you would be liable, whether that mind would be liable to sensual desire or to ill will, because those things are on the same domain. So you can simply ask yourself that question. So right here, right now, while I'm sitting in this room, having a pleasant mood enduring. So that's the establishment of the situation based on what present feeling endures. You don't need to rush for the answer, as I often say. So allow this situation to endure. Don't mystify it, but certainly don't try to provide answers for it. If you have any doubt, so now there's doubt, you can ask, well, am I still feeling a positive or a good to neutral mood, whichever way you want to describe it. And if the answer is yes, means the same mood is still enduring. So that's the important bit to discern, and then allow it to endure. So then even your doubt is secondary to how you're feeling right here, right now. Again, if you're not rooted at the point where things converge, which is at the point of present enduring feeling, that's when doubt can take over you. But as I said, you just have to re-include it. Include the doubt in the present enduring feeling. And even if it's unpleasant, then you surmount it by being mindful of the feeling that's there beforehand, pretty much, because you're doubting your mood only because that mood is there, or you're doubting how you might be feeling because you must be feeling something. So so in the specific context of establishing a mind above sensuality, even temporarily, so to speak, you have to aim at establishing your mind above the possibility of sensuality. And that already means that you have been living, certainly for a sufficient amount of time, certainly invested sufficient amount of effort, living withdrawn from sensuality bodily. So if your acts are not withdrawn from sensuality bodily, as in if there is no virtue, basis of virtue and basis of sense restraint, then you're not going to be discerning anything of any of this on the level of the mind. So that's why the virtue needs to come first. Your sila, the precepts, is not the Dhamma, but there is no Dhamma without it. And this is exactly why. You cannot possibly discern the liability to sensuality on the mental level when you're fully immersed in it physically. Or certainly when you haven't been withdrawn from it long enough physically. So taking for granted that you have been withdrawn long enough physically, as in you have been keeping the precepts, then you are creating a certain, well, to an extent, some degree, a degree of a basis for this discernment. And discernment is as follows. You just ask yourself, on the basis of present enduring feeling, am I liable to sense desire? As in, is this mind that's present enduring this currently positive, pleasant feeling, is it liable to be taken up by sensual craving, gripped by it, under the pressure of sensual desire? If you're not sure, means it is. So not being clear that you are free from it, to that extent you are not free from it. So you can review the possibility, and that's already what sensuality is, by the way. You don't need to be reviewing possibility and then waiting for sensuality to come. There is no sensuality to it. Sensuality stays on the level of possibility, or rather begins already on the level of possibility. So if you deal with it over there, then you wouldn't have to be dealing on it on the level of physical and senses, because possibility to sensual desire is already sensuality. It's already a sensual desire. So that's what we mentioned in other talks. You can imagine a possibility of sensual engagement, and that's already where your gratification begins. Begins on the level of the thought, of the prospect of sensual engagement, of the prospect that is actually unpleasant. Because if the prospect of sensual engagement were already pleasant, felt pleasantly at the fundamental primal level, the desire towards what that prospect directs you would be inconceivable, because you're already within the satisfied pleasure. But that's the whole point. It's felt unpleasantly, and it directs you in a direction towards sense object that will make this unpleasantness less, be felt less. And that's why people end up developing a gratuitous assumption that that which you get down that direction is pleasant. But it isn't. It's just slightly less unpleasant, but it's equally within the same unpleasantness. And the important point here to start seeing this direction is to recognize that first you start with sense of pleasure. So for a mind that's not free from sensuality, you cannot possibly see it as unpleasant first, and then you can sort of emulate seeing of that, and that's a good way to that's an inevitable way to start. But the point is, factually speaking, on the basis of your present enduring experience as a whole, sensuality is felt pleasantly. That's the first step. So that's why it's important to practice sense restraint, because if you're not allowed, if you're not able to allow the that pleasure to manifest for what it is, you won't be able to see it. And by not being able to allow pleasure to manifest for what it is means not having practiced sense restraint sufficiently enough or well enough. So as soon as this pleasure prospect of this pleasure starts to increase, you're bound to give in. So again, that's why sila needs to be developed first, so that you can then allow this thing to arise and then understand it for what it is. See the pain in it, inherent. The heart of it is always painful, cannot be different. So you would be able to allow that if you haven't been habitually, automatically, carelessly acting on the level of the physical based on that desire. So basically, if you haven't been given in to sensuality on the level of your body. If you're able to allow that pleasure that's felt first, it's then within the basis of that enduring prospect of pleasure, which is pleasant, within that basis you get to understand the pressure that it fundamentally exerts on you. And you can ask yourself, you being pressured, is that pleasant or unpleasant? It's always unpleasant. always unpleasant. So within the presently enduring pleasure of the prospect of sensuality, you get to understand that it's always fundamentally felt painfully. And that's the important thing. For as long as you assume, even to the tiniest of the degrees, that pleasure of the prospect of sensuality is in the direction of these sense objects, even tiny little bit more than it's on the level of the presently enduring painful pressure that it exerts over you, to that extent you assume it to be different. To that extent you give it its own being of sensuality, as in being that pertains to over that thing over there, that is being promised as the object of your sense. So that's why once you're able to allow that pleasure to rise, so you mustn't be like, I must get rid of this, I must get rid of this, and you certainly mustn't be giving in physically. Once you're able to allow it to endure, you will see that the pleasure that you feel of that endurance is actually the pain of its pressure. It's the same thing, literally, just the other coin of the same thing. And at that point, it will be impossible for you to regard that prospect of pleasure as anything other than painful. And that's exactly what the Buddha described in the suttas we mentioned in previous talks as well, in Majjhima Nikaya. The point being, engagement with sense object was always actually unpleasant. Always. So, and you will know that it was always unpleasant because, again, ask yourself, can you even conceive going down the direction of a sense object, pursuing it, engaging with it, using it for gratification, if there is no desire for it? So the context of your engagement with sense object is always the desire of the sense. Always. It's inconceivable. Because if you engage with a sense object without a desire for the sense object, that's not sensuality. That's not an engagement. There is no lust and aversion, basis for lust and aversion in it. So that's why you recognize that the context, peripheral context of your presently directed mind towards sense object is always unpleasant pressure of that sense desire. So if that is the inevitable, inseparable, unremovable, irremovable context of any sensual direction, means any sensual direction is then that which pressures you, because of which it's painful. So it's important to not create a distinction, as I said, temporal distinction or even spatial distinction for that matter, between the pleasure that you feel first on the prospect of sensuality and the underlying inherent pressure it exerts over you, which is the pain. So then the prospect of pleasure is directly determined by the prospect of pressure exerted over you. In other words, pleasure you feel, it's actually the pain that pressures you. And the reason you feel it pleasant is because the direction of it is the direction of possible escape from it. So again, imagine that, like you're imprisoned, you're being tortured, and suddenly a thought occurs in your mind that allows a possibility of escape from the torture. Now, if the possibility of escape from the presently enduring exerted torture over you, if that possibility is slim, well, you're not going to get very elated. It's going to be, but yeah. But imagine that possibility being really quite realistic. Well, you will have trouble containing your excitement. And that's exactly the definition of sensuality when it comes down to senses. Imprisoned by the desire, that then determines the extent of pleasure you will feel, as in the extent of possible escape from it. So the greater the desire, the greater possibility of escape. And thus, for the ignorant mind, the greater pleasure. So that's what I mean. You have to admit that there is this great pleasure or medium pleasure. Pleasure is there. Once you admit, you will get to see that pleasure is felt pleasantly because it's determined by the pain. In other words, the pain is felt pleasantly. The underlying pain, the peripheral pain, the context of pain is felt pleasantly because you're looking away from it. And that's exactly in the sutta that we quoted before. The Buddha said, it was that gave the simile of the leper and using the burning embers to cauterize his scratching wound, that offers him a sense of relief. And the Buddha said, the fire and burning embers were always painful, always. The only reason that he was finding it pleasurable, genuinely, otherwise he wouldn't be doing it in the first place. A leper would not have been going to the embers if they were not providing him at least some degree of pleasure. But I would have said that pleasure was always actually painful. The only reason he was finding a relief in it, delighting in it, being happy on account of it, was because of his condition of leprosy. That's it. And condition of leprosy is the condition of ignorance in regard to your own sensuality, in regard to your own pressure of the sense desire. Because once the leper learns that the first thing he must do in order to cure his leprosy is stop scratching it and stop burning it with fire, then he'll get to realize that, yeah, that truly is the way out. So sense restraint must be first, and then you get to understand that what you used to do on account of escaping from sensuality was actually just making sensuality worse. Because you were just, by being pressured from pain that you were feeling pleasantly, you were causing yourself even more pain that was then felt even more pleasantly, that was making you cause even more pain that was being felt even more pleasantly. That's why sensuality is endless. You can't satisfy your desires, and you certainly will never run out of preferences. The mind will always keep pushing further and further and further if that's the direction it goes. And it can go infinitely because that's not the direction where the desires are. Yet, as I said, any engagement with sense object is on account of you not wanting sense desire to be there. So once you realize that always, whenever there is a sense desire, there is always a criteria of not wanting it. And that's a good criteria. It's just then choosing how you go about it, that's what determines it, whether it's going to be sensuality or not. So any sense desire is not wanted because it's unpleasant, because it's pressure. If you give in towards it, trying to alleviate that pain through distracting yourself with sensual pursuit, you're making it worse. If you don't go towards it, you might increase the pain initially because, as I said, the leper does get a degree of a relief from scratching and burning it with fire. So once he stops engaging with that degree of relief, the things are going to go worse, but they're going to start healing. And that's the point here. Healing means you start to understand that it doesn't matter how tiny prospect of pleasure arises in your mind, if it's directed at the senses, you know it's because it's painful. That's why it's pleasure, because it's painful, because it pressures you. Thus, the escape of it is pleasant, only because of the pressure. Would you be elated at escaping the torture chamber if you're not imprisoned there, if you can come and go as you leave? You wouldn't. There would be no delight at the prospect of escaping it because you are not imprisoned by it. So that's exactly what I mean. The genuine pleasure that sensuality offers, even actually while you're amidst of physical engagement with sensuality, the happiness of it, the joy, the pleasure, is the pleasure of pain felt on the level of the same things being present. So the happiness of sensuality is because of the painful presence of the same sensuality. It's the same thing, just two different directions, and you keep choosing to look at the direction that distracts you from it. That's why we keep insisting on the developing mindfulness of the peripheral and the context, because this is all found in the context. As I said, you start with a thought of sensuality. What is the context of it? Well, it's the peripherally enduring context of desire for that. Now you get to discern the peripherally enduring context of the desire for this particular sense, then you also get to discern further peripheral. What are the characteristics of the presently enduring pressuring desire to eat something or touch something or smell something of pleasant nature? Well, the fact is that it's pressuring you unpleasantly. Always. Can you be pressured pleasantly and then go and seek the escape from it? No, why would you do that? There's nothing to escape from. So you are pressured by the pain of it. That is the, as I said, inherent context of any sensual direction. So you would be going down to sensuality because you want to avoid pain. So then you realize, okay, I want to avoid pain. That's absolutely fine. What is the best way of going about it? Going down to sensuality clearly keeps making it worse. What if I were to restrain so the mind can have a chance to develop in regard to this pressure and is not pressured by it anymore? When the mind is not pressured by the prospect of sensuality, the mind has surmounted the domain of sensuality. So we come back to how we started. How to contemplate, how to develop mind that would surmount the domain of sensuality is develop the mind that cannot be pressured by the possibility of sensuality. In other words, develop the mind that will always be able to quickly, instantaneously, simultaneously discern sensual or reason thought as pain, and then it won't go near it. You won't even have to then make the effort to not go near it. It won't go near it. And that's again what the Buddha would describe by the leper who has now healed his leprosy and his wounds. He said, well, imagine now that he's healed, skin normally covered, and now two strong men come and pick him up and try to carry him back into those burning embers. Wouldn't he resist and kick and scream and like think anything else except going into the embers? Yes, of course he would. So that's exactly the point. Even the slightest thought, the factual presence of possibility of sensuality, right in your face, access to sensual objects will be pain. Access to pain, and the mind will like completely shiver away from it. It's just, it will not even entertain it for a second. Because if it does entertain it for a second, means to that second it still thinks it's pleasant first, not unpleasant first. If it's unpleasant first and the pleasure of it can never step outside of the context of the pain, means that pleasure is not pleasure, is just distraction from pain, which is felt pleasantly only because of the perspective of the pain, greater pain. So that's it. You maintain the context, you maintain the mind above sensuality, and mind above ill will for that matter. Because ill will is equally directional. Something upsets you, that's already unpleasant. What you do, you want to get rid of the unpleasure. How do you get rid of that displeasure? By attacking that which upset you. But if you realize that you cannot possibly be upset by that which comes through the sense objects, you can only be upset by resisting the pressure of that which comes through sense objects. Now you stop resisting. It means, yeah, as the Buddha said, you can literally endure sticks and stones, abuse, verbal abuse, physical abuse, and the mind will be incapable of anger. Not like you have to keep it free from anger. It will be incapable from anger because anger is painful. Sticks and stones are not painful. Objects of your senses are just agreeable or disagreeable. They're not on the level of pain and suffering. However, you being pressured by the possibility of escaping anger, that's where your suffering is. You being pressured by the possibility of escaping the pain of sensual desire, that's where the suffering is. That's why these things are always underlined by the inherent craving for getting rid of it. Getting rid of the sensual desire because it's unpleasant, getting rid of the pain because it's unpleasant. Sorry, getting rid of the aversion, pain of aversion because it's unpleasant. So you give in to anger, you give to sensual object, you give in to the offered direction of less pain, failing to see that less pain is still pain. More pain, less pain shares the nature of pain. But yes, if you forget that and start looking, well, as long as I avoid greater pain for the sake of less pain, then less pain will be regarded as pleasure. And the extent of that pleasure is basically the extent of the pain that underlines it.